The moment I stepped into my brother's engagement party, I heard her say it. She didn't even bother lowering her voice. The bride leaned toward her bridesmaid's champagne flute, tilted just enough to catch the light, and whispered with a sneer that carried clean across the marble floor. "Oh, great. The stinky country girl is here." The women around her laughed, the kind of tight, polished laughter that isn't spontaneous but rehearsed, the kind that lands like a slap. I felt it before I understood it, a familiar heat rising to my face, my shoulders instinctively drawing in as if to make myself smaller. I stood there for half a second too long, my boots planted at the entrance, my coat still on, the noise of the room swelling around me like water closing over my head. No one corrected her. No one looked uncomfortable. My brother stood a few feet away, smiling for a photo, blissfully unaware or conveniently deaf. My mother glanced in my direction, her eyes flicking over me, the way you assess a stain and decide whether it's worth addressing. Then she turned back to the bride's mother without missing a beat. I let them laugh. I let them see me exactly the way they wanted to see me. Because what none of them knew, what not a single person in that glittering room understood, was that I owned the company behind this venue. Every server moving silently between tables answered to me. Every chandelier above their heads was insured under my signature. And by the end of the night, that whisper was going to cost them far more than their pride. I didn't move right away. I stood there long enough for the insult to settle, for the humiliation to sink its hooks in deep. That feeling wasn't new. It had teeth, but it was familiar, like an old ache that flares up when the weather changes. I took a slow breath and scanned the room, not in anger, but out of habit. Years of learning to read a space before it swallowed me whole had taught me that instinct. The ballroom was immaculate, every detail carefully curated to impress. Cream-colored linens, low crystal centerpieces, soft lighting that made everyone look just a little better than they were. It was elegant in a way that screamed money, the kind of place chosen specifically to intimidate anyone who didn't belong. I was meant to feel out of place here. That was the point. I caught my brother's eye briefly. He smiled at me, distracted already, turning back to someone more important. The bride stood at the center of everything, radiant, confident, perfectly at ease. She had already forgotten me. To her, I was background noise, a minor disruption quickly dismissed. My mother drifted past close enough that I could smell her perfume. She didn't stop. She didn't say my name. She just murmured something to the bride's aunt about how everyone was finally here, as if my presence were a box checked rather than a person acknowledged. The message was clear. Don't make this awkward. Don't draw attention. Don't remind anyone that you exist. I felt 12 years old again, standing at the edge of a school gym during a dance I hadn't been invited to, but somehow ended up at anyway. Same posture, same instinct to disappear, but I didn't leave. Instead, I stepped fully into the room. The music swelled, glasses clinked, and conversations overlapped in a steady hum of privilege. People moved around me without seeing me, their attention locked on the bride and her family. Her parents held court near the center, loud and charismatic, their laughter carrying farther than it should have. They spoke with the easy confidence of people used to being deferred to, used to assuming they belonged wherever they stood. I drifted toward the edge of the ballroom, close enough to observe without being pulled into conversation. Years ago, I had learned that the edges were where the truth lived. People performed at the center. They revealed themselves at the margins. A waiter passed me with a tray of champagne. He hesitated for half a beat when he saw me, his eyes flicking up in recognition before he masked it instantly. Our gazes met. I gave the slightest shake of my head, almost imperceptible. His shoulders relaxed and he moved on. Good. Not yet. The bride's laughter rang out again, sharp and bright. She was in her element, greeting guests, accepting compliments, basking in the kind of attention that fed something hungry behind her eyes. She wore entitlement well. It sat on her like it had always belonged there. I watched her closely as she worked the room. Every smile was calculated. Every touch lingered just long enough to feel intimate without being sincere. She treated people differently based on what they could offer her, and she did it without apology. When she passed me again, her gaze slid right over me, dismissive, almost bored. That dismissal was deliberate. I recognized it instantly. It was the same look teachers had given me when they'd already decided who the smart kids were. the same look relatives wore when they talked about my brother's future and referred to mine in vague, polite terms. It said, "You don't matter enough to be worth my energy." I leaned against one of the tall cocktail tables and folded my hands, grounding myself in the smooth surface beneath my fingers. Somewhere behind me, a group of guests were talking about the venue, marveling at the service, the atmosphere, the seamless execution of the event. "This place is incredible," one woman said. "Do you know who owns it?" I smiled to myself but said nothing. My mother finally approached me, her expression already tight with disapproval. She glanced down at my boots, then up at my face, her smile thin and performative. "You could have dressed up a little," she said quietly, as if my appearance were a personal affront. "This is an important night." I nodded. "I came straight from work." She sighed the same weary sound she'd used my entire life. Whenever I failed to meet an expectation she'd never bothered to explain. "Well, just try not to stand out." And there it was, the unspoken rule. Be invisible. Be grateful for whatever scraps of inclusion you're offered. She turned away before I could respond, already reabsorbed into the social current, pulling her toward the bride's family. I watched her go a familiar hollow opening in my chest. I let it sit there. I didn't fight it. I had learned a long time ago that denying pain only gave it more power. The bride clinked her glass to get everyone's attention, her voice carrying effortlessly across the room. She announced something about how grateful she was to be joining such a wonderful family. Her eyes swept over the crowd, stopping on my brother, then her future in-laws glowing with pride. They applauded. I did not. As the room settled back into conversation, I took another slow breath and let my gaze roam the space again. I noticed things others didn't. The way staff subtly deferred to certain guests. The way the bride's parents whispered urgently to each other when they thought no one was watching. The way my brother laughed a little too loudly, like he was trying to convince himself this was all real. A senior manager passed near me, his posture stiffening when he recognized me. He started to smile, then caught my eye and stopped himself just in time. I inclined my head slightly, a silent acknowledgement. His relief was visible. Everything was running exactly as it should. I stayed where I was, quiet, observant, underestimated. I didn't defend myself. I didn't correct anyone's assumptions. I let the bride have her moment. I let my family believe the story they'd always told themselves about me. Because I hadn't come here for approval. I hadn't come here to be seen. I had come here because something in this room belonged to me now, and before the night was over, that truth was going to surface, whether they were ready for it or not. I took a sip of champagne, savoring the calm that settled over me like armor. They thought this night was about celebration. For me, it was about watching and waiting. Standing there at the edge of the ballroom, watching my brother soak in admiration that seemed to roll toward him as naturally as breathing, something inside me loosened its grip on the present and pulled me backward. It always happened like that. A sound, a look, a tone of voice. Tonight, it was my mother's sigh, that tired, disappointed exhale she reserved just for me. It slipped under my skin and carried me years away, back to the house where I learned early what my role in this family was supposed to be. I grew up knowing exactly where I stood, or rather, where I didn't. My brother had been the golden child from the moment he learned to walk. He was charming without trying, confident without effort. Teachers praised him. Neighbors adored him. Relatives bragged about him at every holiday gathering as if his achievements reflected directly on them. If he brought home good grades, they were framed and displayed. If he won an award, it was mentioned for years. And me, I was the comparison. If I did well, it was never enough to simply be good. It was always, "That's nice, but your brother did better." If I struggled, it was a personal failing, evidence of some flaw in my character rather than a moment of learning. I learned quickly that attention was conditional, that praise was scarce, and that love felt like something you earned only by not asking for it. My parents never said it outright. They didn't need to. Favoritism doesn't announce itself. It settles in, quietly disguised as practicality. My brother needed more guidance. He had more potential. I was more independent. I was strong. I could handle it. I was always the one who could handle it. I remember one birthday in particular, the kind that lodges itself in your memory because it teaches you something important about how the world works. I was a teenager old enough to pretend I didn't care, young enough to still hope. I came home from school expecting something small, a cake, a card, maybe just acknowledgement. The kitchen was quiet. My mother was on the phone laughing. My brother burst through the door a few minutes later, excited, waving a flyer for a competition he had entered. Everyone gathered around him, asking questions, offering congratulations. An hour passed, then 2. Finally, I mentioned it. Just once. Softly. "It's my birthday today." My mother blinked, genuinely surprised. Then she smiled apologetically and said we'd celebrate later. She told me not to make a big deal out of it. My brother patted my shoulder and said we could order pizza another night. Later never came. That was the day I learned that wanting something didn't make you entitled to it. It made you inconvenient. Whenever I tried to talk about how these moments made me feel, the conversation followed the same script. I was too sensitive. I was imagining things. I needed to stop comparing myself. My parents insisted they treated us the same, even as the evidence piled up quietly around me. They told me my brother needed more support. They told me I was easier. They told me I didn't need as much reassurance. Each explanation landed like a brick added to a wall I hadn't realized I was building around myself. So I adapted. I stopped sharing my disappointments. I learned to swallow frustration before it reached my mouth. I became the low-maintenance child, the one who asked for nothing and expected less. It earned me peace, but it cost me something too. I learned to associate silence with safety, invisibility with survival. By the time I was old enough to leave, the decision felt less like rebellion and more like relief. There was no dramatic argument, no slammed doors. I packed quietly, folded my clothes neatly, and told my parents I had an opportunity elsewhere. They nodded, offered practical advice, and went back to their routines. No one asked me to stay. That realization hurt more than any shouting match ever could have. It confirmed what I had always suspected. My absence didn't disrupt the balance of the family. It restored it. As I stood in that ballroom years later, the memory pressed against me with uncomfortable clarity. The same pattern was playing out, just dressed in finer clothes. My brother was being celebrated. My mother was basking in reflected pride. And I was expected to blend into the background, grateful for inclusion, but not entitled to impact. I watched my brother from across the room. He laughed easily, his arm draped around the bride's waist, oblivious to the way her smile tightened when she thought no one was watching. He looked happy, or at least convinced that he was. Part of me wanted to protect that happiness. Another part recognized the familiar danger in how eagerly he accepted admiration without questioning its cost. My mother stood nearby, telling anyone who would listen how proud she was, not of the family as a whole, of him. Her voice carried across the room, confident, assured, as if this moment validated every decision she had ever made. I felt a flicker of something then, sharp and unexpected. Not anger, not sadness, clarity. This wasn't about the bride's insult. That had been crude, yes, but it wasn't new. The real wound had been inflicted long before tonight. The whisper had only reopened it. I realized that for the first time, I wasn't scrambling to prove my worth to anyone in that room. I wasn't waiting for recognition or apology. I had already built a life where my value wasn't debated at family dinners or measured against someone else's success. They didn't know that, and that ignorance had shaped everything that followed. I had left without fanfare and stayed away without explanation. I had built quietly, deliberately, without inviting opinions or applause. I had chosen distance not out of spite, but out of self-preservation. It was easier to grow without being constantly reminded of who I was supposed to be. Tonight, standing there unnoticed, I understood something important. Their underestimation wasn't an obstacle. It was a gift. It had kept me free to learn, free to fail privately, free to succeed without anyone reaching out to claim a share of it. The music swelled again, pulling me back fully into the present. Someone brushed past me, apologizing absently, already forgetting the interaction. I caught my reflection in one of the mirrored walls, the woman staring back at me, calm and composed, her expression unreadable. I wasn't the child who had waited for a birthday cake that never came. I wasn't the teenager who had learned to stay quiet to keep the peace. I was someone else now, someone they had never bothered to get to know. And as I looked around that ballroom at the faces, so certain they understood the hierarchy of the room, I felt something settle into place inside me, a sense of inevitability. They believed this night belonged to them, that the story unfolding was theirs to control. They were wrong. I had learned long ago what happens when you stop asking for permission. Tonight wasn't about stepping back into my family's orbit. It was about standing exactly where I was, on ground I had earned, and letting the truth surface in its own time. I didn't come here to reclaim my place. I came here because the roles they assigned me no longer applied. And before the night was over, they were going to realize that the quiet child they had overlooked had become someone they could no longer ignore. I stayed near the edge of the room, letting people decide who I was before I ever opened my mouth. It was almost comforting how predictable it had become. A quick glance at my boots, my jacket, the way I carried myself without trying to impress anyone. Decisions were made instantly. I was categorized, dismissed, and filed away as irrelevant. Conversations flowed around me as if I were part of the decor, something solid but unimportant. The bride's family didn't even pretend to hide it. Her father's eyes skimmed over me, once assessing, then moved on. Her mother smiled politely and forgot me mid-smile. They were busy identifying who mattered. I wasn't on that list. I had learned a long time ago not to correct people when they were wrong about me. Letting them underestimate me was easier than explaining myself, and far more useful. People revealed so much when they thought you didn't belong in their world. As I stood there half listening to a group of guests discussing the wine selection, my mind drifted back to the moment I left home for good. Not the leaving itself, but what came after. The quiet, the anonymity, the strange relief of being surrounded by people who knew nothing about my family history, my brother's accomplishments, or my supposed shortcomings. My first job after leaving wasn't glamorous. It wasn't even related to what I would eventually build. It was work that paid the bills and asked nothing else of me. I took it because it was available, because it didn't come with expectations, because no one cared where I came from as long as I showed up on time and did what needed to be done. That was where I learned my first real lesson about power. It doesn't always sit at the top. Sometimes it hides in the places people overlook. I watched how systems worked. I paid attention to who made decisions and who simply executed them. I noticed how often people spoke freely around me, assuming I was invisible, assuming I wouldn't understand or remember. They were wrong on both counts. I didn't rush. I didn't announce ambitions I wasn't ready to defend. I observed. I learned. I kept notes in my head and questions to myself. I learned how money moved quietly, how influence was exercised without raising voices, how the most important conversations happened in hallways and after meetings, not in conference rooms. There was no dramatic turning point, no single moment where everything changed. Just a series of small, deliberate choices that compounded over time. I chose consistency over recognition. I chose privacy over praise. I chose to stay quiet while others bragged about things they barely understood. When opportunities came, I evaluated them without emotion. If they didn't align with my long-term goals, I walked away. I didn't chase validation. I didn't need my family to know I was doing well. In fact, I preferred that they didn't. Not telling them wasn't about revenge. It was about control. Every time I considered calling my mother to update her, I imagined the questions that would follow, the advice I didn't ask for, the assumptions, the credit that would inevitably be reassigned. I had seen it happen too many times growing up. My successes would become family achievements. My sacrifices would be minimized. My boundaries would be treated as inconveniences. So I kept my life separate. I learned early that success attracts a different kind of attention. The kind that isn't interested in you as a person, only in what you can provide. Silence protected me from that. It allowed me to build without interference to fail, without commentary to succeed, without obligation. By the time I acquired my first significant stake in a company, my family still believed I was doing fine, at best struggling at worst. I didn't correct them. Their assumptions kept my life simple. That company wasn't flashy. It didn't make headlines. It was infrastructure. The kind of operation people rely on without ever learning the names behind it. I liked it that way. Ownership doesn't need to be visible to be effective. Standing in that ballroom, I recognized the signs immediately. The way the staff moved, the subtle choreography behind the scenes, the familiar structure of authority that mirrored the systems I controlled every day. It was like hearing a song you know by heart playing faintly in the background of a crowded room. A senior staff member passed close enough that I could see the flicker of recognition in his eyes. He slowed instinctively, then caught himself, professionalism snapping back into place. We exchanged a look that lasted less than a second. He knew who I was. I gave him a barely perceptible nod. He continued on posture, easing the rhythm of the evening uninterrupted. Good. The bride laughed again, louder this time, throwing her head back as someone complimented her on the venue. She accepted the praise graciously, as if the excellence surrounding her were a reflection of her taste, rather than the result of years of work she had never seen. Her confidence was unshakable. She believed the night was hers, that everything unfolding around her existed to celebrate her ascent. She had no idea how fragile that confidence really was. I took a slow sip of champagne and let my gaze travel the room. So many people here depended on systems they didn't understand. Salaries paid, contracts honored, standards maintained, all of it invisible, all of it taken for granted. That invisibility had been my choice. I noticed how often the bride's parents checked their phones, how they clustered together near the center of the room, how their smiles faded the moment they thought no one was watching. There was tension there, subtle but persistent, pressure beneath the polish. I filed that observation away. My brother approached me briefly, flushed with excitement, and asked if I was enjoying myself. His eyes slid past me even as he spoke, already scanning for someone else. I told him it was a beautiful event. He smiled, relieved, and hurried off without waiting for more. Watching him go, I felt a familiar mix of affection and distance. He wasn't cruel. He just existed in a world where I had always been peripheral. Tonight was no different. As the evening wore on, the assumptions people made about me grew bolder. A guest asked if I was a friend from back home, his tone polite but dismissive. Another suggested I might want to mingle more, as if I hadn't chosen my position deliberately. I smiled. I nodded. I let them talk. Underestimation had become my camouflage. Near the bar, I overheard a fragment of conversation that caught my attention. A name, a term. Something obscure enough that most people would have ignored it, but it rang clear in my mind. It belonged to a subsidiary I knew intimately, a piece of a larger structure I controlled. I felt the smallest spark of interest then. Not surprise. Confirmation. I shifted my weight, angling myself closer without drawing attention. The bride's father was speaking now, his voice low, his words clipped. He sounded like a man managing multiple timelines at once, not the relaxed confidence of someone celebrating, but the tight focus of someone negotiating. My pulse remained steady. If anything, I felt calmer. The picture was beginning to form, and it wasn't the one they thought they were living inside. Whatever game was being played here, it extended beyond social climbing and family optics. It was professional, strategic, and it brushed up against my world. I straightened slightly, my posture changing without conscious thought. Years of stepping into rooms where decisions were made had trained my body as much as my mind. The staff noticed. So did I. The bride glanced in my direction again, her eyes narrowing for a split second before she dismissed me once more. She still believed she had me figured out, still believed I was harmless. I let her keep that belief. As the lights dimmed subtly and the music shifted, signaling another phase of the evening, I felt the collision drawing closer. Past and present, family and business assumption and reality, all of it converging in this room under this roof. I had spent years building something quietly, carefully, without witnesses. Tonight, I wasn't here to announce it. I was here to see who would reveal themselves when the pressure rose. I took another sip of champagne, savoring the stillness before the storm. Tonight wasn't just personal anymore. Tonight was professional. I decided to stop hiding at the edge of the room. It wasn't a dramatic choice. I didn't straighten my shoulders or rehearse anything clever in my head. I simply stepped forward and let myself be absorbed into the current of the party, moving closer to the center where the bride and her family held court. If this night was a game, then it was time to sit at the table and watch how the other players moved. The engagement party felt less like a celebration the closer I got and more like a carefully staged performance. Conversations overlapped in just the right way. Laughter rose and fell on cue. People clustered around the bride's parents, nodding along as if they were listening to something profound, rather than a string of well-practiced anecdotes. It reminded me of corporate mixers I'd attended in my early years, the kind where everyone pretended to be relaxed while quietly sizing each other up. The bride moved through it all with ease. She had perfected the art of being everywhere without seeming rushed, of making each guest feel briefly important before gliding on to the next. Her smile never quite reached her eyes, but most people were too flattered to notice. She kissed cheeks, accepted compliments, laughed at jokes that weren't funny, and kept her hand possessively on my brother's arm whenever he drifted too far. I watched how she adjusted her tone, depending on who she was speaking to, warm and enthusiastic with people she believed were useful, polite but distant with those she deemed irrelevant. When she passed me, she didn't bother masking her disinterest. Her gaze flicked over me and moved on as if my presence required no acknowledgement at all. That dismissal wasn't accidental. It was a calculated move, and I recognized it instantly. Eventually, she approached me, likely deciding that ignoring me entirely might look impolite. Her smile was flawless when she turned it on, her voice light and pleasant. "I don't think we've really talked," she said as if the oversight were mine. "I'm so glad you could make it." I matched her smile, keeping my expression neutral. "Congratulations. It's quite an event." She glanced at my clothes again, quick and subtle, then tilted her head. "So what do you do?" she asked, already assuming the answer wouldn't interest her. "I work," I said simply. There was a pause. "Just a beat too long." She laughed softly, assuming I was joking. "Well, of course. But I mean what field?" I shrugged. "Operations, management, depends on the day." Her interest faded immediately. She nodded politely, already scanning the room over my shoulder. "That must keep you busy." "It does," I said. She waited, clearly expecting me to elaborate to justify my existence in terms she understood. When I didn't, her smile tightened. "Well," she said, patting my arm as if humoring a child, "enjoy yourself." And just like that, she was gone, swept back into the center of the room where attention fed her. I let out a slow breath and continued observing. Her parents were harder to ignore. They were loud in a way that demanded space, their presence filling the room without apology. Her father spoke in sweeping gestures and confident declarations, telling stories that always positioned him as the decisive hero. Her mother laughed often and loudly, flashing jewelry that caught the light with every movement. They dropped names constantly, companies, cities, people of supposed importance. It was a performance designed to overwhelm, to signal wealth and influence without ever stating it outright. I had seen this kind of behavior before, usually from people who needed to be believed more than they needed to be honest. My family listened with rapt attention. My mother nodded eagerly, her pride palpable. My brother hung on every word, clearly impressed. He looked like someone who had finally been invited into a room he'd always wanted access to, and he wasn't questioning the cost of admission. As I stood there pretending to admire the decor, I caught fragments of conversation drifting past. Mentions of opportunities, of future plans, of things that would fall into place after the wedding. The language was vague, but the intent was unmistakable. This marriage was being framed as a strategic alliance, not just a romantic milestone. I edged closer, positioning myself near a column where the music dipped just enough for voices to carry. The bride's father was speaking again, his tone lower now, more focused. He mentioned timing, pressure, something about needing stability before a certain deadline. His wife nodded sharply, her hand tightening around her glass. They stopped talking the moment someone approached, their smiles snapping back into place like masks. That was my first real red flag. This wasn't how people talked when they were relaxed and celebrating. This was how they spoke when something was at stake. I replayed earlier interactions in my mind, seeing them through a new lens. The questions about my brother's job, the casual inquiries about family assets, The way they'd praised my mother's home lingering just a little too long on its location and size. At the time, it had sounded like polite interest. Now it felt like assessment. My brother found me again, grinning, his face flushed with happiness. "They're amazing, aren't they?" he said, gesturing toward the bride's parents. "So well connected. So supportive." I studied him for a moment before responding. "They certainly seem confident." He laughed. "That's success for you." I didn't argue. There was no point. He wasn't ready to hear anything that might disrupt the narrative he was clinging to. I watched him walk away again, his posture open, trusting, and felt a familiar tightening in my chest. He wasn't just in love. He was being positioned, and he didn't even realize it. As the evening wore on, the engagement itself began to feel less like the focus and more like a backdrop. The bride's family continued to circulate, collecting information, reinforcing impressions, subtly steering conversations. They weren't just celebrating, they were securing something. I realized then that they believed my family had value beyond social optics. They thought we had resources, influence, stability, something they needed or wanted access to. Whatever assumption they were operating under, it was strong enough to motivate this entire performance. The irony sat heavy in my stomach. I moved toward the bar, ordering a drink I didn't really want, just to have something in my hand. From there, I had a clear view of the room. The bride laughed loudly at something someone said, her confidence unwavering. Her parents leaned close together, speaking in hushed tones between smiles. My mother beamed, basking in the attention, oblivious to the way she was being evaluated. I felt the shift then, subtle but unmistakable. This wasn't just family drama. This was something else entirely, something calculated, something that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with leverage. I took a slow sip and let my gaze linger on the bride's family, watching their movements, their timing, their expressions. The pieces were starting to align, forming a picture that made my skin prickle. They thought they were choosing us. In reality, they were hunting something they didn't understand, and the longer I watched them play their game, the more certain I became that whatever they believed they were gaining from this engagement, it rested on a foundation far shakier than they realized. I set my glass down and straightened my mind, already moving ahead, cataloging details, preparing questions I hadn't yet asked. This night was no longer about insults or old wounds. It was about figuring out exactly why they had set their sights on my family, and what they planned to do once they thought they had us locked in place. As the party carried on around me, something shifted in the air, subtle enough that most people missed it. The laughter was still there. The music still floated through the room, polished and upbeat. But beneath it all, I felt a tightening, like a wire being pulled too far beneath the surface. I stopped listening to what people were saying and started paying attention to how they were saying it. Who moved quickly? Who lingered? Who kept checking their phone as if waiting for something that refused to arrive? The bride's family had changed their rhythm. Her father had stepped away from the center of the room twice in less than 10 minutes, his confident stride replaced by something sharper, more urgent. Each time he returned, his smile snapped back into place, but it took him longer to find it. Her mother stood closer to him now, their heads inclined together whenever they thought no one was watching. This wasn't the easy intimacy of a couple celebrating their daughter. It was the tight coordination of people managing pressure. I drifted toward the hallway, leading to the restrooms, drawn by instinct more than intention. The noise softened there, the music dulled by distance and heavy doors. I pretended to check my phone, angling myself just out of sight when their voices reached me. They didn't know I was there. Her father's voice was low-clipped. "We just need to get through tonight," he said. "After that, things stabilize." Her mother replied quickly. "You said that last month. The calls aren't stopping." There was a pause filled only by the hum of the building. Then he said, "The wedding changes things. It buys us time. Time. Stabilize. Get through tonight." Those weren't the words of people celebrating an engagement. Those were the words of people running out of options. I held my breath, every instinct sharpened. This wasn't gossip. This wasn't nerves. This was strategy. I had sat in enough closed-door meetings to recognize the tone. This was crisis management. They fell silent, abruptly, footsteps approaching. I stepped back into the light just as they rounded the corner, their expressions smooth once more. Her mother glanced at me, eyes flicking over my face, assessing whether I had heard anything. I smiled politely and walked past them without slowing. Back in the ballroom, the party seemed louder, brighter, almost aggressive in its cheer. The contrast made my skin crawl. I replayed the words in my head, dissecting them the way I would a contract clause or a risk report. Get through tonight. After that, things stabilize. The implication was clear. Tonight mattered. This engagement party wasn't just symbolic. It was a checkpoint, a deadline. I scanned the room again, this time with new focus. The questions her parents had asked earlier took on different meaning. The interest in my brother's job, his future prospects, the casual comments about family stability. They weren't being friendly. They were gathering information, verifying assumptions. My mother, proud and oblivious, had answered eagerly. She always did when someone showed interest in our family, mistaking attention for respect. She spoke about how well things were going, how fortunate they were, how everything had finally fallen into place. I felt a twist of something bitter in my chest. She didn't know she was being used as evidence. Another detail surfaced then, small but unmistakable. Near the bar, I overheard the bride's aunt speaking to someone I recognized as a mid-level manager from one of my regional operations. She laughed, touched his arm, and mentioned an upcoming review, her tone overly familiar. He stiffened slightly, smiling but guarded. That was no casual acquaintance. I felt the second crack form, clean and sharp. This wasn't a coincidence layered on top of another coincidence. This was a pattern. I took a slow walk across the room, my mind assembling pieces rapidly now. Their confidence, their urgency, their interest in my family's perceived stability, their familiarity with people they shouldn't have known at all. It pointed in one direction, and I didn't like where it was leading. They thought my family had something. They thought we were a solution. I found my brother near the dessert table, laughing with one of the bride's cousins. When he saw me, his smile widened, the same automatic warmth he'd always reserved for moments when he wanted things to feel uncomplicated. "Isn't this amazing?" he said. "I can't believe how generous her parents have been." I studied his face, searching for doubt, for hesitation. There was none. He was standing at the center of something he believed he had earned, and that belief made him dangerously blind. "They seem very invested," I said carefully. He nodded. "They really believe in us. In the future. The future." I almost said something then. Almost pulled him aside, almost asked him if he'd noticed the tension, the whispers, the way his fiancé's parents never quite relaxed. But I stopped myself. If I spoke now without proof, it would sound like jealousy, like resentment, like the same old narrative they'd always used to dismiss me. I couldn't afford that. So I smiled and told him I was happy for him. He squeezed my shoulder and turned back to his conversation, reassured, satisfied. I watched him go, with a heavy sense of inevitability. I moved back toward the quieter edge of the room, my earlier calm giving way to something colder, more precise. The insults from earlier felt almost irrelevant now. This was bigger than my pride, bigger than old wounds. If I was right, my family wasn't just being mocked. They were being targeted. I slipped my phone from my pocket and sent a short message, coded and brief, to someone I trusted. No details, just a request for information, a confirmation of something I was starting to suspect. While I waited, I watched the bride. Her confidence was still there, but it wavered now and then, cracking under the weight of whatever she knew her parents weren't saying out loud. She laughed too loudly at the wrong moments. Her eyes darted more often toward the exits, toward her parents, toward the clock. Time was pressing in on them. My phone vibrated softly in my hand. I glanced at the screen, my pulse steady, but my focus absolute. The response was short, cautious, and enough to send a chill down my spine. "You're not wrong. There's pressure. I'm looking into it." I slipped the phone away and leaned back against the wall, exhaling slowly. The shape of the problem was clear now, even if the details were still forming. They believed my family had resources they could anchor themselves to. They believed this marriage would secure something vital, something they needed to survive whatever storm was closing in on them. And whatever assumption they were operating under it led straight back to me. I had to decide what to do with that knowledge. Part of me wanted to step back, to let events unfold without interference. Let them discover too late that they had miscalculated. Let my family feel the consequences of ignoring the quiet daughter who saw things clearly when no one else did. But another part of me, the part that had built everything I stood on now, knew that doing nothing carried its own cost. If they were wrong about the source of their imagined stability, the fallout would land squarely on my brother and my mother, on people who had hurt me, yes, but who were still mine. I looked around the room one more time, taking it all in. The elegance, the false confidence, the carefully curated joy stretched thin over something brittle and dangerous. I made a decision then quietly, without ceremony. I wasn't going to confront anyone yet. I wasn't going to warn my brother or challenge the bride. Not until I knew exactly what they thought they were gaining and how far they were willing to go to get it. Before this night ended, I would have answers. And once I had them, this engagement party would become something very different from the celebration they believed it to be. Once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. I stopped watching faces and started watching systems. The servers moved in quiet coordination, trays exchanged at precise intervals, empty glasses disappearing before they lingered too long. Security adjusted positions subtly as the room filled, never obstructing sightlines, never drawing attention. Vendors checked in with a single point person near the service corridor, their questions answered quickly and without debate. It was a machine I recognized intimately. The bride's family interacted with that machine differently than the rest of the guests. They didn't wait. They didn't ask. They signaled. A nod here, a lifted finger there. Requests were met instantly, not because they were important tonight, but because someone believed they were important always. That belief didn't come from this engagement. It came from somewhere else. I stood near a floral arrangement and pretended to admire the work while I watched the bride's father approach one of the senior floor managers. They exchanged a few words too quiet for anyone else to hear. The manager nodded, his expression professional, but strained, and walked away quickly. The bride's father checked his phone jaw tight. That wasn't social familiarity. That was operational. A moment later, I heard it. Just one word dropped casually as the bride's mother passed behind me. Northline. It was barely audible, lost in the hum of the room, but it landed in my mind with the clarity of a bell. Northline wasn't a brand anyone outside the industry would recognize. It wasn't printed on signs or splashed across marketing materials. It was a holding entity, a quiet spine that supported several regional operations. One of mine. My pulse didn't jump. My breath didn't catch. The reaction stayed internal, contained, sharpened. That was all I needed. I shifted slightly, angling myself toward the service corridor where the lighting dimmed and conversations grew more functional. A familiar face appeared near the catering station, someone I trusted. His posture stiffened when he saw me, surprise flashing briefly before discipline took over. He stepped closer under the pretense of checking a clipboard. "Is everything all right?" he asked, his tone neutral. I met his eyes and lowered my voice. "I need confirmation," I said, discreetly. He nodded once, already understanding. No questions, no hesitation. That was why he was where he was. I turned away before anyone could notice the interaction, my heart steady, my mind already mapping what this meant. A few minutes later, he passed by again, this time without stopping. He adjusted his cuff and murmured, "They're contracted through a subsidiary, multiple points of reliance." I exhaled slowly. They weren't just familiar with my operations. They were embedded in them. The scope of it unfolded quickly in my head. Employment ties, vendor agreements, reputation buffers built on association. Without the structures I controlled, their public confidence would collapse like scaffolding pulled from a half-finished building. And they had no idea who held the switch. I let my gaze drift back to the bride. She was laughing again, head tilted, just so accepting congratulations, as if the future were already secured. Her confidence was almost admirable in its purity. She truly believed she was untouchable. I thought of her whisper at the door, the way she had dismissed me without a second thought. The irony settled over me like a calm, heavy blanket. She had mocked the person who signed the contracts. She had sneered at the foundation beneath her own carefully constructed world. The anger I might have felt never came. In its place was something cleaner, colder, control. This wasn't about ego anymore. It wasn't even about revenge, not really. It was about responsibility, about what happened when personal cruelty intersected with professional risk. If I did nothing, the consequences wouldn't stop with her family. They would ripple outward, touching people who had nothing to do with tonight's theatrics, employees, partners, my own family who were walking blindly into something far more dangerous than embarrassment. I stepped away from the center of the room and found a quieter corner, my mind running through options. Exposure was easy, too easy. A single word spoken at the wrong moment could detonate everything. But detonation wasn't the goal. Precision was. I pulled my phone out again, fingers moving quickly but calmly. Messages went out to 3 people, each phrased differently, each asking for something specific. Documentation, timelines, safeguards. No alarms, no sudden moves. Everything would stay exactly as it was for now. Across the room, the bride's father raised his glass for an impromptu toast, his voice booming with forced cheer. People applauded, unaware of the strain beneath his performance. I watched him closely, noting the slight tremor in his hand, the way his eyes kept flicking toward the exits. He was running out of time. My brother stood beside the bride, smiling, his arm firm around her waist. He looked proud, secure, convinced he was stepping into a future built on mutual admiration and shared success. The sight of him tightened something in my chest. I asked myself then what this was really about. Was I protecting him? Or was I finally done absorbing the fallout of everyone else's choices? The answer was uncomfortable in its honesty. It was both. I wasn't interested in humiliating anyone publicly. I didn't want to scorch the earth and walk away. I wanted accountability. I wanted the truth placed where it could no longer be ignored. And I wanted my family out of harm's way. A member of the waitstaff approached me with a fresh glass, offering it politely. I declined with a shake of my head, my focus fixed elsewhere. I didn't need anything to dull my senses. Not tonight. The bride approached again, her expression sharper. This time her smile stretched thin. "You seem very calm," she said, as if that were an accusation. "Are you always like this?" I met her gaze evenly. I prefer to understand what's happening before I react. Her eyes flickered irritation flashing through before she masked it. "Well," she said lightly, "not everything needs to be analyzed." I almost laughed. She drifted away again, confident that she had dismissed me once more. I watched her go, noting the way her shoulders were held just a bit too rigid, the way she kept glancing toward her parents for reassurance. Confidence built on assumption is fragile. I took another slow breath and sent one final message, this one to legal. Nothing dramatic, just a heads up, a request to be ready. The engagement party surged on, blissfully unaware that the ground beneath it had shifted. Music played, glasses clinked, smiles were exchanged and photographed, frozen into memories that would soon feel unreal. I stood there unnoticed and unchallenged, holding a truth that would change everything once it was released. They needed this marriage, needed it to anchor them, to buy them time, to create the illusion of stability they could hide behind. They believed my family was the key. They believed the door was open. What they didn't know was that the door already belonged to me, and I was standing on the other side, deciding exactly how and when it would close. The night was far from over, and the longer they celebrated, the closer they came to discovering just how badly they had miscalculated. After the confirmation settled in my chest, a strange calm followed. The noise of the party faded into something distant and manageable, like music heard through a closed door. The humiliation from earlier no longer burned. It had done its job. It had sharpened me. Now there was only focus, the kind that comes when emotion finally gives way to clarity. I stopped thinking like a sister and started thinking like someone who had built a system from the ground up and knew exactly how fragile those systems could be when the wrong people leaned on them. I needed to decide what this night was actually going to be about. Not revenge for a careless insult. Not proving anyone wrong. Those were temptations, not goals. The real question was simpler and heavier at the same time. How do I stop people like this from hurting others, including my own family, without becoming someone I don't recognize? I leaned against the wall near the service corridor and let my thoughts organize themselves the way they always did when the stakes were high. First, define the objective. Protect my family from being used. Expose manipulation clearly enough that it couldn't be dismissed as misunderstanding. And do it in a way that would hold up in the light of day, not just in the heat of the moment. Public humiliation was easy. Anyone could blow up a room with the right words at the right time. That wasn't power, that was impulse. Power was timing. I began listing leverage points in my head, each one precise and unemotional. Contracts, dependencies, reputational risk. The bride's family relied on more than one thread connected to my organization. Pull the wrong one too hard, and everything would snap at once, collateral damage included. Pull the right one slowly, and the structure would reveal itself without me having to raise my voice. I sent another message, short and measured, to my legal counsel. No details, just a signal to be ready. I reached out to compliance next, asking for verification on something I already suspected. Each response came back quickly, efficiently. No panic, no questions. They trusted my judgment. That trust mattered. Across the room, the bride's parents regrouped near a tall cocktail table, their heads close together. Their smiles had thinned, but they were still performing, still confident that whatever pressure they were under could be managed if they just stayed ahead of it. I recognized that mindset. It was the same one I'd seen in executives who believed their reputation would protect them from consequences. It rarely did. My brother crossed the room toward me, his expression bright, unguarded. "You disappeared," he said, half joking. "Everything okay?" I studied him for a moment. He looked genuinely happy, the kind of happy that makes you reckless, the kind that convinces you red flags are just decorations. "Everything's fine," I said. He nodded, satisfied, and launched into a story about someone he'd met, someone important, someone impressed with him. I listened, really listened, and felt the weight of what was coming settle heavier in my chest. Whatever happened next would change him. There was no avoiding that. When he wandered off again, pulled back into the orbit of the bride and her family, I made a quiet promise to myself. I would not blindside him if I could avoid it, but I would not protect him from the truth either. There was a difference. The bride approached me again not long after, her patience clearly thinning. She smiled, but the warmth was gone now, replaced by something sharper. "You've been very quiet tonight," she said. "Are you always this observant, or is this just a special occasion?" I met her gaze calmly. "I find it's better to listen when people are talking." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Well," she said with a short laugh, "tonight is about celebration, not analysis." "For some people," I replied. The words landed between us, subtle but unmistakable. She held my gaze a beat too long, then looked away, her jaw tightening. I watched her walk back to her parents, her confidence shaken just enough to notice. Good. I checked the time. Things were moving faster than I'd anticipated. Whatever deadline they were racing toward was close. That meant my window was narrow. I stepped into the service corridor again, this time with purpose, and spoke quietly, with two people who had been part of my operations for years. There were no explanations, no justifications, just instructions, secure records, flag communications. Be ready to present facts if asked. They nodded and moved immediately, as efficient as ever. When I returned to the ballroom, the energy had shifted again. The bride's father attempted another round of charm, louder now, more animated, as if volume could drown out unease. Guests laughed politely, some glancing around in confusion, sensing the disconnect, even if they couldn't name it. My mother watched all of this with growing uncertainty. Her smile faltered. She adjusted her posture, glanced at me once with a questioning look she didn't voice. For the first time that evening, she seemed unsure of her footing. I felt a flicker of something then, not satisfaction, but resolve. This was exactly why I had to be careful. The truth wouldn't just topple the bride's family. It would ripple outward, forcing my own family to confront things they had ignored for years. I asked myself one last time if I was ready for that. The answer didn't come as bravado or anger. It came as acceptance. I had spent too long shrinking myself to keep others comfortable. Tonight wasn't about tearing anyone down. It was about refusing to be complicit in a lie. The music shifted again, signaling the next phase of the evening. Speeches would be coming soon, cameras would be raised, attention would sharpen. The bride laughed, leaning into my brother, her hand gripping his arm a little too tightly. Her parents stood tall faces, composed, unaware that the narrative they thought they controlled was already slipping. I looked around the room one last time, taking in the guests, the lights, the polished surfaces hiding so many assumptions. Everyone believed they knew what this night represented. A beginning, a celebration, a promise. For me, it was a deadline. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and straightened my decision made and my course set. Whatever happened next would happen because it needed to, not because I wanted spectacle or revenge. They thought tonight was the start of something permanent. I knew better. Tonight was the moment everything they were relying on began to unravel, and I was done pretending I didn't see it coming. The moment before everything changed felt deceptively ordinary. Music drifted through the ballroom, glasses clinked, and the bride stood near the center, glowing under soft lights, as if the night itself had been designed to flatter her. People gathered closer now, sensing that speeches were coming. Phones appeared in hands. My mother adjusted her posture, smoothing her dress, ready to be seen as part of something important. My brother looked happy. That was the hardest part. I checked the time without anyone noticing. Everything was aligned, too aligned. The calm before impact always had a way of announcing itself if you knew how to listen. The first interruption was so small most guests didn't register it. The music faded a beat too early, then resumed. A server hesitated near the stage, whispering urgently into an earpiece. Someone laughed too loudly to cover the pause. The room corrected itself quickly, but the bride's parents noticed. Her father's smile stiffened. He glanced toward the service corridor, then back at the guests, raising his glass in a spontaneous toast that landed flat. Applause followed out of politeness, not enthusiasm. I watched the bride's mother lean toward him, her hand gripping his sleeve a little too tightly. Their whispers were sharp, urgent. Whatever they had been expecting, it hadn't happened, or something had happened that wasn't supposed to. That was when I knew the first lever had been pulled. The tension spread quietly, the kind that crawls rather than explodes. The bride laughed again, but her eyes kept flicking toward her parents, searching for reassurance. Her confidence faltered just enough to show the seams beneath it. I didn't move. I didn't react. I had learned that silence at the right moment could be louder than any accusation. Across the room, my brother frowned, sensing something off. He leaned down to ask the bride a question, his brow creased with confusion. She shook her head, smiling too brightly, brushing it off. He nodded, but the doubt didn't leave his face. My mother noticed it too. Her pride dimmed, replaced by uncertainty. She glanced around, scanning the room, as if looking for cues she no longer trusted. When her eyes met mine, there was a flicker of something unfamiliar there. Questioning, not accusation, just uncertainty. The next shift was more visible. An announcement was supposed to be made. I could tell by the way people had clustered by the expectant hush that had settled over the room. Instead, there was a delay. The DJ cleared his throat, said something about a minor adjustment, and filled the space with background music that felt suddenly intrusive. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The bride's father stepped away, phone pressed tightly to his ear, now his jaw working as he listened. His wife followed, heels clicking sharply as they disappeared into the hallway. That was when the curiosity started. People leaned closer to one another, voices dropping. Someone speculated about a technical issue. Someone else joked about nerves. But the laughter didn't stick. It slid off the tension and disappeared. I felt my phone vibrate softly in my pocket. I didn't look at it yet. I didn't need to. I already knew what it would say. The bride found me near the edge of the room, her composure fraying. She didn't bother with politeness this time. "What did you do?" she demanded quietly, her smile gone. I looked at her calmly. "Why would you assume I did anything?" Her eyes flashed. "Don't play games with me. Things don't just happen like this." I tilted my head slightly. "Sometimes they do." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "If you're trying to sabotage this because you're jealous, you're going to regret it." The word jealous landed between us heavy and tired. I almost felt sorry for her then. Almost. "I'm not trying to sabotage anything I said evenly. I'm just letting the truth surface." Her breath caught, just for a second. Then she scoffed and turned away, muttering something under her breath as she returned to the center of the room. I watched her go, noting the tension in her shoulders, the way she kept glancing toward the hallway where her parents had disappeared. The crowd's attention shifted back to the stage as movement drew their eyes. The screens behind the DJ flickered the slideshow of smiling engagement photos, stuttering for a moment before going dark. A technician rushed forward, his expression tight, conferring urgently with someone out of sight. That was no technical glitch. My phone vibrated again. This time I checked it. First confirmation received. Sponsor alignment withdrawn. Secondary verification pending. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and exhaled slowly. The bride's parents reappeared, their expressions carefully neutral, but the damage was done. They tried to reinsert themselves into the flow of the party, but their confidence was gone. Conversations stalled when they approached. People smiled politely and then drifted away. The power in the room had shifted. My brother approached me again, his voice low. "Do you know what's going on?" he asked. I met his eyes, seeing the uncertainty there, the beginning of awareness. "Not yet," I said truthfully, "but I think we're about to." He nodded slowly, unsettled, and turned back toward the bride just as another murmur rippled through the crowd. Someone pointed at the screens. The technician had managed to bring them back online, but the familiar engagement photos didn't reappear. Instead, a generic holding slide glowed there, blank and impersonal. The bride's father moved quickly toward the stage, his voice sharp as he spoke to the DJ. The DJ shook his head, gesturing helplessly toward the control booth. I received another message. "Second layer confirmed. Documentation secured. Stand by." The room buzzed now, speculation turning louder, less restrained. Phones were out openly. People whispered their curiosity, overpowering politeness. The bride stood frozen for a moment, her perfect posture cracking as she realized she no longer controlled the narrative. Her mother leaned in close, whispering furiously. Her father scanned the room, eyes darting, calculating exits that didn't exist. My mother stood very still, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The pride she'd worn all evening had drained away, replaced by something like fear. She looked at me again, really looked at me this time, as if seeing me for the first time in years. I held her gaze steady and unflinching. This wasn't chaos. Not yet. It was the beginning of accountability, and it moved more quietly than people expected. A final vibration from my phone confirmed what I already knew. The first domino had fallen. I felt a weight settle over me then, not excitement, not triumph, responsibility. Whatever came next would change lives, including my own. There was no stepping back now, no pretending this was about a misunderstanding or a bruised ego. I looked at my brother, at the woman beside him, who no longer looked so certain of her future, at the guests who had arrived expecting nothing more than champagne and spectacle. After tonight, nothing between us would be the same. The bride wanted a flawless public moment. What she had created instead was a countdown. And as the murmurs grew louder and the lights seemed suddenly too bright, I understood that the night had crossed a threshold it could never return from. The party didn't end when the music stopped pretending everything was fine. It fractured into pockets of forced conversation and uneasy silence, the kind that settles after something has gone wrong, but before anyone knows how bad it really is. People lingered because leaving felt rude, but staying felt dangerous. Smiles were thinner now. Laughter came late and died quickly. The bride's parents had retreated into a side room near the service corridor. I knew without seeing them that they were no longer celebrating. They were calculating. My phone vibrated again, heavier this time, as if the message itself carried weight. New information, urgent. I stepped away from the ballroom, slipping into the same quiet hallway where I'd overheard them earlier. The walls seemed closer now, the air tighter. I opened the message and read it slowly, once then again. What I felt wasn't shock. It was recognition. This wasn't just a family reaching for stability. It wasn't just social climbing or strategic marriage. The engagement was a shield, a carefully chosen one. The bride's family wasn't simply under pressure. They were under investigation. Not rumors, not speculation. Formal inquiries, financial irregularities flagged months ago, contracts scrutinized, assets frozen quietly while they scrambled to keep the facade intact. The wedding wasn't meant to elevate them, it was meant to buy time, to complicate jurisdiction, to attach themselves to a family they believed was insulated, respectable, and quietly wealthy. My family. They hadn't admired us. They had selected us. The realization landed hard, heavier than the insult at the door, heavier than years of being overlooked. This wasn't arrogance, it was predation. I leaned back against the wall, grounding myself, and forced my breathing to stay slow. Pieces fell into place with brutal clarity. The urgency, the timelines, the fixation on stability and appearances, the belief that once the marriage happened, scrutiny would soften questions, would be delayed, consequences postponed. They needed legitimacy. They needed distance. And they thought my brother was the perfect anchor. Anger flared, then sharp and bright, but I didn't let it take over. Anger was useful only if it sharpened focus. I thought of my brother's open smile, my mother's pride, the way they had leaned into this engagement without suspicion, because it felt like finally being chosen by people who seemed important. I had to stop this. Not later. Not quietly. Not in a way that allowed them to slip away and regroup somewhere else. If I walked away now, if I decided it wasn't my problem, the fallout would come eventually, and it would hit my family without warning. My brother could be entangled legally. My mother's reputation dragged through something she didn't understand. Silence would make me complicit. I pulled up the attached documentation and skimmed it carefully. Shell companies, overlapping accounts, patterns that were obvious once you knew where to look. This wasn't incompetence. It was deliberate. And there were victims far beyond this room, people who had trusted them, invested with them, lost because of them. I felt the weight of the choice settle in. This was no longer about revenge. This was about stopping something that shouldn't be allowed to continue. My phone rang softly in my hand, the caller ID familiar. I answered without hesitation. "I'm seeing it," I said before the other person could speak. "It's worse than we thought," they replied. "They're accelerating, trying to close loops before the end of the night." Of course they were. "How exposed are they?" I asked. "Enough," came the answer. "If the right information becomes public, they won't be able to explain it away." I closed my eyes briefly. Then we're done waiting. I ended the call and stood there for a moment longer, letting the decision settle into something solid and unmovable. There would be no half measures, no quiet warnings, no private deals. Anything less would give them room to escape. I turned back toward the ballroom. The bride stood near the center, her face pale now, the sheen of confidence completely gone. She laughed at something someone said, but the sound was brittle, almost desperate. Her parents were still absent, which hadn't gone unnoticed. Guests whispered openly, now speculation no longer restrained by politeness. My brother spotted me and started toward me, his expression tight with concern. "Something's wrong," he said quietly. "They're not telling me everything." I looked at him, really looked at him, and felt the familiar pull to protect, to soften the blow. But lies had brought us here. More lies wouldn't get us out. "There's a reason for that," I said gently. He searched my face. "Do you know what's happening?" "Yes," I said. "And you're going to hear it soon." His jaw tightened. From who I didn't answer him right away. I glanced toward the stage where staff were moving with purpose, now guided by instructions I had already given. Screens were being checked, microphones tested. The room hummed with anticipation and unease. "From the truth," I said finally. His eyes widened slightly, but before he could ask anything else, the bride's mother reappeared. Her expression set in a way that confirmed everything I already knew. She whispered urgently to her daughter, her gaze darting toward the exits, toward the screens, toward me. The bride followed her look. For the first time all night, her eyes met mine without dismissal. There was fear there now, real fear. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply held her gaze steady and calm and watched understanding begin to dawn. She took a step toward me, then stopped, glancing back at her parents, torn between confrontation and survival. The music cut abruptly. Not a fade, a cut. The DJ cleared his throat, uncertainty plain on his face, and stepped back as the lights shifted slightly, drawing attention to the screens behind him. The murmurs quieted curiosity, overtaking discomfort. My phone buzzed one last time. All confirmations in place. Authorities notified. Proceed. I slid the phone into my pocket and felt a strange stillness settle over me. This was the point of no return. Whatever happened next would not be contained within this room. It would ripple outward, public, and permanent. I thought of the years I had spent being underestimated, dismissed, told to stay quiet for the sake of peace. Tonight, silence would do more harm than good. The bride's father pushed forward, trying to regain control, but the momentum had shifted beyond him. Staff moved with quiet efficiency, screens flickering to life with something new cued behind the scenes. My brother stood beside me now, tension radiating off him. "You're scaring me," he said softly. I met his gaze, my voice steady. "I know." I scanned the room one last time, taking in the faces of people who had come expecting nothing more than a celebration. None of them knew yet that they were about to witness the collapse of a carefully constructed lie. The bride's family had planned an exit. They just hadn't planned for me. As the lights brightened and the room fell into expectant silence, I understood with absolute certainty that whatever sympathy I might have felt earlier was gone. They had crossed a line that couldn't be smoothed over with charm or apologies. They had tried to hide behind my family, and now there was nowhere left to hide. The countdown was over. The room went silent in a way that felt unnatural, like the air itself was holding its breath. No one had announced anything yet, but instinct told everyone something was coming. Conversations died mid-sentence. Glasses froze halfway to lips. Even the bride seemed to sense it, her shoulders stiffening as she followed the direction of every other gaze toward the screens behind the stage. The first image appeared without explanation. It wasn't dramatic. No music, no flashy transition, just a clean, official-looking document enlarged across the ballroom screens. Most of the guests didn't understand what they were looking at first. Legal language tends to do that. Dense, impersonal, easy to ignore, until names appeared. The bride's father stiffened so abruptly it was almost violent. His wife's hand flew to her mouth, a sharp intake of breath cutting through the silence. The bride stared at the screen, unblinking her face, draining of color as recognition hit. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "What is that? Is that a court filing? Why are their names on it?" The document changed. Another page, then another. Dates, jurisdictions, financial summaries highlighted in red. Words like investigation and misrepresentation stood out even to untrained eyes. I hadn't said a word yet. I stepped forward slowly, not rushing, not dramatic. Just enough that people noticed movement where none had been before. Someone near the front whispered my name, confusion sharpening into attention. I took the microphone from the stand without asking permission. "Good evening," I said. My voice sounded calm, steady, louder than I expected in the quiet. The sound of it seemed to anchor the room, giving shape to the tension instead of letting it scatter. "I'm sorry to interrupt what was supposed to be a celebration." I continued, pausing, just long enough for the apology to land. But it wouldn't be right to let this night continue without clarity. The bride's father stepped forward. "This is highly inappropriate," he said, his voice strained, the confidence gone. "There's been some kind of mistake. I didn't look at him yet. I kept my eyes on the crowd. "There's no mistake," I said. "What you're seeing are public records. Verified. Cross-checked. Active." The screens shifted again. This time the information was simpler. Timelines. Connections. A clear visual trail showing how companies fed into each other, how money moved in circles instead of forward. Even without understanding the details, the shape of the truth was unmistakable. This engagement, I said quietly, was never just about love. The room erupted into whispers. The bride finally found her voice. "You don't get to do this," she said, stepping forward, her words sharp and panicked. "You're jealous. You've always been jealous." I turned to face her then. "No," I said evenly. "I'm prepared." That landed harder than any insult could have. I took a breath and continued, my tone measured. "Your family is currently under investigation for financial misconduct. They've been attempting to shield themselves by attaching their name to perceived stability, to my family. My brother sucked in a sharp breath beside me. I glanced at him briefly, just long enough to acknowledge the pain on his face, then looked back at the crowd. They believed this marriage would buy them time. It won't. The bride's mother began to cry, soft at first, then louder, her composure shattering completely. Her father stood frozen, his face red, his jaw clenched, his eyes darting toward the exits like an animal calculating escape. "You can't prove any of this," he snapped. "This is slander." I finally looked directly at him. "It's evidence," I said, "and it's already been submitted." That was when the doors at the back of the ballroom opened. The sound was subtle, but the effect was immediate. 4 people in dark suits stepped inside, badges, visible expressions, professional and unyielding. They didn't rush. They didn't need to. The bride made a small broken sound. Someone gasped. Her father took 1 step back, then another, his bravado collapsing into raw fear. "We can explain," he said, his voice cracking. "This isn't what it looks like." One of the agents spoke calmly. "Sir, please step forward." The bride's mother clutched at her husband's arm, sobbing openly now. "Please," she said to no one in particular, "this is a misunderstanding." The agents didn't argue. They didn't threaten. They simply weighted the weight of inevitability settling over the room like gravity. The bride turned to my brother, then desperation etched into every line of her face. "You have to stop this," she pleaded. "Tell them she's lying. Tell them you know us." My brother stared at her, his expression hollow. He opened his mouth, closed it again. Whatever he had believed about their future was crumbling in real time. "I don't know you," he said quietly. The words were soft, but they cut deeper than any shout. Her face twisted, shock giving way to rage. She spun toward me. "You ruined everything," she screamed. "You were supposed to be nothing. You were supposed to stay in the background." I stepped closer, lowering my voice so only she could hear. "You should have learned this by now. People who stay quiet aren't always powerless." Security moved in quickly as she lunged, catching her before she reached me. She struggled, screaming, her perfect image unraveling completely. The agents took control of her parents, first guiding them toward the exits as the room erupted into chaos. Guests pressed back phones, raised voices overlapping in shock and disbelief. I stood there, microphone still in my hand, the noise washing around me. When it finally quieted enough, I spoke again. "I know this is a lot," I said. "The food has already been paid for. The bar will remain open for those who choose to stay." A few nervous laughs rippled through the room, disbelief mixing with adrenaline. Then I set the microphone down and stepped away. My brother turned to me, his face pale. "You knew," he said. "All this time." "I knew enough," I replied. He nodded slowly, grief and relief warring in his expression. "Thank you," he said, his voice breaking. "Even if it hurts." I watched as the bride was escorted out, her screams fading down the hallway, her future collapsing behind her. The woman who had mocked me at the door was gone, replaced by someone exposed, desperate and utterly alone. As the doors closed behind them, a strange quiet settled over the ballroom. The engagement was over. But for the first time that night, the truth was finally free to breathe. The aftermath was quieter than I expected. Not peaceful, just drained. Like a storm that had torn through a town and moved on, leaving debris and stunned silence behind. The ballroom looked the same on the surface, but everything felt different now. Ice sculptures melted unnoticed. Half-empty champagne flutes sat abandoned on tables. People spoke in low voices, as if raising the volume might bring the chaos back. My brother sat alone near the bar, staring into a glass he hadn't touched. The confident posture he'd worn all evening had collapsed, inward shoulders, rounded hands clasped tightly together. When I approached, he didn't look up right away. "She wasn't who she said she was," he said finally, his voice flat. "None of them were." "No," I replied gently. "They weren't." He let out a short, humorless laugh. "I feel like an idiot." I shook my head. "You feel like someone who trusted the wrong people. That doesn't make it better." "No," I admitted, "but it makes it human." He looked up at me, then really looked at me, as if trying to reconcile the sister he thought he knew with the woman who had just dismantled an entire lie in front of him. "How long?" he asked. "How long have you been like this?" I understood what he meant. Not how long had I known about them. How long had I been capable? Longer than you think I said. Longer than anyone noticed. He nodded slowly, absorbing that. "You saved me tonight. I didn't do it alone," I said. "They did most of the work themselves." "That's not what I mean," he said quietly. "You didn't have to step in. You could have let me marry her. Let everything blow up later." I met his gaze. "I could have. Why didn't you?" The question hung between us, heavier than anything else that had been said all night. I thought about my answer carefully. "Because I know what it's like to realize too late that no one had your back," I said. "And I wouldn't wish that on you, not even after everything." His eyes filled, but he didn't let the tears fall. He nodded once sharply, as if sealing something inside himself. Across the room, my mother stood frozen near a table, her hands shaking as she folded and unfolded a napkin she didn't need. She looked smaller somehow, stripped of the confidence she'd worn like armor for years. When she finally walked toward us, each step seemed uncertain, like she wasn't sure she was allowed to approach. "I didn't know," she said as soon as she reached us. "I swear I didn't know." I held her gaze. "You didn't know about them," I said, "but you didn't know me either." She flinched at that. "I thought—" She stopped, swallowed hard. "I thought you were fine. You never said anything." "I did," I said quietly. "Just not in ways you were listening for." Her eyes dropped to the floor. "I thought you didn't need us. You were always so distant." I almost smiled at the irony. "Almost. I learned to be," I said, "because every time I needed something it felt like I was asking for too much." Silence stretched between us. My brother watched, saying nothing, finally understanding that this reckoning wasn't just about a failed engagement. "I made mistakes," my mother said, her voice breaking. "I see that now. I put all my faith in the idea of what I wanted this family to look like, instead of the people actually standing in front of me." I nodded. "That's the truth." She reached out, then hesitated, her hand hovering between us. "Can we fix this?" she asked. I didn't answer right away. Honesty mattered too much to rush this. "We can try," I said finally, "but it won't look like pretending nothing happened." She nodded, tears slipping free at last. "I don't want pretending anymore. That was something, at least." The guests thinned out, gradually murmuring goodbyes that sounded more like apologies than pleasantries. By the time the last of them left, the ballroom felt cavernous and empty, echoing with the ghosts of a night that would be talked about for years. Staff moved quietly, efficient and respectful, dismantling the illusion piece by piece. Tables were cleared, lights dimmed, the space transformed back into what it really was. A room, not a stage. I stood near the center for a moment, breathing it in. This place had witnessed lies, cruelty, desperation, and truth all in the span of a few hours. It didn't judge. It just held the weight. My brother joined me again as we watched the room empty completely. "What happens now?" he asked. "For them," I said. "Consequences." And for us, I thought about that. About how nothing would ever be simple again, but how maybe it didn't have to be. For us, I said, we figure out who we are without pretending. He nodded slowly. "I don't know how to do that." "Neither do I admitted. "But we can learn." Later, when the hotel was quiet and the adrenaline had finally worn off, I stepped outside alone. The night air was cool against my skin, grounding. I leaned against the railing and let myself feel everything I'd kept contained for hours. The anger, the sadness, the strange relief. I hadn't won anything tonight. But I hadn't lost myself either. For years I'd been treated like an afterthought, a background character in my own family's story. Tonight that narrative ended. Not with applause or approval, but with clarity. I didn't need to be chosen. I had already chosen myself. As I stood there watching the city lights flicker in the distance, I understood something with absolute certainty. Power isn't loud. It doesn't need permission. It waits. It observes. And when the moment comes, it acts with precision. The girl they thought was nothing was gone. What remained was someone who knew exactly who she was and exactly what she would never tolerate again. And that knowledge felt like the beginning of something far more lasting than any engagement ever could. 3 weeks later, the hotel felt like itself again. The marble floors gleamed the way they always had. Guests moved through the lobby with rolling suitcases and distracted expressions, unaware of the night that had nearly turned this place into a headline. That was how I preferred it. Buildings remember things people don't, and I didn't need the walls reminding anyone of what had happened. I sat in my office overlooking the city morning light spilling across the desk, reading through reports that confirmed what I already knew. The investigation was moving fast, faster than the bride's family had ever expected. Accounts frozen, properties seized, charges filed, the kind of momentum that doesn't slow down once it starts. They were done. My brother came by later that afternoon, not announced, not dramatic, just a knock on the door and a familiar, hesitant smile. He looked different, lighter in some ways, older in others. "I didn't know how to act around you," he admitted, settling into the chair across from me. "I think I was afraid if I acknowledged what you'd built, it would mean admitting how wrong I'd been." I leaned back, folding my hands. "We all avoid things that challenge the stories we tell ourselves." He nodded. "I'm trying to change that." We talked for a long time about childhood, about the pressure he'd felt to be perfect, about how I'd learned to survive by becoming invisible. There were apologies, real ones, the kind that don't demand forgiveness but offer accountability instead. When he left, it felt like something fragile had finally been set down gently instead of dropped. My mother called the next day. She didn't ask for anything. She didn't defend herself. She simply said she was listening now and that she understood if trust took time. I told her it would. We both accepted that as the truth. That night, I attended a small gathering in one of the hotel's private dining rooms. Investors, partners, people who spoke in measured tones and cared about long-term consequences. Halfway through, a young woman stood near the door, clearly out of place, clutching a folder to her chest like a shield. Someone made a comment under their breath, something dismissive, something careless. I stood up before the words could settle. I introduced her by name, explained why she was there, what she had accomplished, what she was about to build. The room shifted instantly. Respect replaced assumption. Opportunity replaced judgment. She looked at me with wide eyes, gratitude written all over her face. I recognized that look. After everyone left, I walked through the lobby alone, listening to the quiet hum of a place doing what it was meant to do: serve, shelter, stand firm. I paused near the entrance, remembering the moment I'd stepped inside weeks ago, dismissed before I'd even been seen. Funny how quickly things can change. People will always judge you based on what makes sense to them. Your clothes, your background, your silence. They'll decide who you are long before you speak. Let them. While they're busy looking down on you, they'll miss what you're building beneath their feet. I didn't need revenge in the way people imagine it. I didn't need shouting or humiliation or applause. What I needed was truth in the open and control returned to the right hands, and I got that. If you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or quietly pushed aside, remember this: power doesn't announce itself. It waits, it learns, and when it moves, it doesn't ask for permission. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Where are you watching from, and what stood out to you the most? Your comments mean more than you know, and reading them reminds me why these stories matter. If you're not already subscribed, consider staying with us. There are more stories like this ahead about resilience, justice, and the quiet strength it takes to stand your ground. Thank you for being here.